Hello, welcome to our BHBA presentation on race conscious leadership. As I understand it, CLE information and confirmation of completion of the CLE will be automatically emailed out to participants. So folks don't need to worry about typing particular things into the chat box. It'll happen on its own. Very thrilled about a lot of the new developments at the Beverly Hills Bar Association in 2020, particularly under the latest administration with our president, Adam, and a very exciting board. One of the things that happened last year is we decided to reboot and reinvigorate the BHBA's Inclusion Committee. And I think Levon Lawson, one of our past presidents, was really one of the key kickstarters of that. And so Kendra Thomas and I are very thrilled to co-chair the committee. We've recently been joined by Tiffany Fox and Atiria Clark, and we're always looking for additional members, and we're going to be building out an executive committee a bit further for that part. And with respect to other aspects of the BHBA, I'd also like to mention in terms of leadership pipelines and so forth, we're always excited to have volunteers, and we also have some wonderful fellowship opportunities for people that would like to get more involved, that maybe have particular passions and projects they'd like to pursue, particularly in the pro bono arena and elsewhere through our fellowship program. So please ping me back channel if you'd like more details about that as well. And so as to our panel today, I am very excited to welcome Ilham Askia. You know, there is a slide deck, and I will leave it to Ms. Askia as to the distribution if she's okay with us doing that later on. She's nodding yes, so I believe that perhaps those will become available afterwards. So I'll let her address that more fully. So my introduction to Illy actually came on November the 9th, before we'd actually met. And so BHBA was pleased to host a session moderated by our executive director, Belinda McCauley, and Professor / former public defender, Jonathan Rapping, who's a co-founder of Gideon's Promise. And Mr. Rapping, he developed his experience in this area as a public defender and public defender trainer in Washington, D.C., as well as Georgia, as well as in post-Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and currently is a professor at a number of major Ivy League universities. And he mentioned that part of the inspiration for Gideon's Promise was his collaboration and in many ways multiple levels of partnership with Illy that I'm sure she will touch upon, and her story in particular, having lost a parent to the system very early on in her life. And so it's just so wonderful that she's able to use her bachelor's in urban planning from Cornell and her master's work in childhood education and elementary education from Trinity University in Washington, D.C., to become a part of what has become really the largest and most significant in many ways public defender training and educational entity that is national, with I believe in our information might even be outdated and smaller than in reality, 104 partnership arrangements that encompass 29 states and even the Virgin Islands. So on that note, I am excited to turn it over to Ms. Askia.
I want to thank the Beverly Hills Bar Association for inviting me. Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, Belinda, for inviting me. So some of you that are on this call today, this video today, had the pleasure of watching or talking to or speaking to or listening to Jonathan Rappin, our co-founder of Gideon's Promise. I have the distinct honor of being the executive director of Gideon's Promise, and some of you may heard a little bit about my story. So I'm here with you today, not as a lawyer. I'm here today as a person who is representing family members who are also impacted by the people you serve. And so I want to first, before I share my screen, put this disclaimer. I am used to presenting in front of full audiences of public defenders and investigators that work with public defender offices, social workers. So when I say the term public defender, I mean anyone who is representing someone who is labeled as an indigent client or anyone who is serving in the defense community. So I put us all together. I say I'm not a lawyer, I play one on TV. So I designated myself about 10 years ago as an honorary public defender. But today we're going to talk about something that people have been apprehensive to talk about for a long time. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about race-conscious leadership and what has made Gideon's Promise and what has made other organizations and entities, law firms, boutique law firms, major law firms, and public defender offices, for me, more importantly, what has made them really say, let's talk about race. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I want to make sure I put this disclaimer out, is that when you think about race, for the most part, or you say the word race, most people get apprehensive, okay? And so what I want you to understand right now, even when you put your questions in the Q&A, this is a comfortable space. This is a safe space. You can ask me anything as we go through. I'm going to try to address most of your questions at the end. I have one second disclaimer. What Lydia was so sweet in trying to allude is Jonathan and I are married. So just like sometimes you may steal your partner's socks or t-shirts, sometimes I steal his videos. So for those of you who had the opportunity to see him speak, you may notice a couple of videos that are similar to his presentation that we both use, but the story to those videos are very different. So today I want to talk about race-conscious leadership. How do you understand? You talk about what's happening, right? 2020 was a very interesting, very challenging, very thought-provoking year. And as we begin 2021, we will continue to have the conversations. And I don't want people to forget that the conversation, the changing of culture is not over, right? We need to continue these very difficult and crucial conversations moving forward. So today's objectives, because as you know, I'm a former educator, is first to understand how implicit bias contributes to racism in your workspaces. Create a value proposition in transforming your office into a safe space for open dialogue. I think that is one of the critical things is people want to jump in and fix the problem, but first you have to create an environment where you and your teams feel safe in having these crucial conversations. And the last thing is to determine the tools you need to have these honest conversations. I'm a firm believer. I have presented in front of a number of people. I've been spoken to at a number of events, but I'm a firm believer to always leave you with some tools that can help you in guiding your work. So like I said, I steal my husband's socks, I steal his videos, but I come into this work helping to reform the criminal legal system and work specifically with public defenders because I'm a child of a formerly incarcerated person. When I was 5 years old, my father was sentenced to 10 years in Attica Correctional Facility, which is one of the worst state institutions in the country. At the time it was, and it still is. And so as a little girl, is when I was introduced to the legal system, and I was introduced that a brown girl like me and people that came from the neighborhood I came from, we were different and why. And it really is, as Mr. Rapping said earlier when he spoke to this association before, we need to change the narrative, right? We need to change the way we think about people. We need to reflect and look at ourselves. The client is the most important person, right? You all support people who are accused, right? Whether they are guilty or innocent is your duty to represent. And for that client, the representation does not begin and end with attorneys. It is just not the attorney. So today, what I'm going to talk about in terms of race conscious leadership is how do all of these pieces, families, community, mitigation specialists, social workers, the attorneys who are in the courts, investigators, and support staff, how do all of these people help support the clients? And you must always consider race as a factor in your work. But before you can even think about discussing how to have race conscious leadership, you have to first define what kind of leader are you? Right? And also, for those of you who have the title of leader, just because it says executive director or director of or partner or member, there are people in your organization that don't have the title. They're your administrative support specialists. They're your social workers. They're your custodial engineers that may also be leaders to help support your work. So think about that. When I say leader, I'm not just talking about people who have the title. So before you can talk about race-conscious leadership, you have to decide what kind of leader are you. And so the 5 practices of exemplary leadership model was a book developed by Kouzes and Posner, which talks about the 5 leadership styles, right? You model the way, right? You establish principles about the way people should be treated, and you as a leader demonstrate what it is to do. If you want them to do something, you do it yourself. Whenever I hire people, I said, there's nothing that I haven't done, from cleaning the toilet and the bathroom to speaking in front of hundreds of people. Nothing is beneath me as a leader. Inspire a shared vision. Do you have a vision? Have you set and articulated that vision to your entire team? And then bring others who understand that vision and help you carry that out. Challenging the process, right? This is the most important piece right now in our day and time as we deal with this COVID-19 pandemic and the racial justice movement, is changing the status quo. It is very easy to be comfortable, right? But we need to understand that it is okay. You got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So finding innovative ways to improve what you are doing. I think that's why we're all on this call today. Enable others to act. Foster collaboration to build a spirited team. Look at the talent within your team. Who is the person on your team, and I'm going to talk about this later, who you can talk to and say, hey, I'm recognizing that the people of color, and I use this interchangeably, people of color, Black people, in my office are all navigating to one quarter, and I don't understand why, right? What can we do? Some people may have better ideas than you, and you have to be open to accept that and then allow them to act. And then encourage the heart. So this part, we talk a lot about generations, and I'm gonna get into that in a minute, is look at your team's contributions. Recognize them. Sometimes we get so inundated in the work, or sometimes we challenge because we've been in court all day, or we've been listening to families all day, and we don't stop and celebrate our successes, or celebrate that we had a sentence reduction, and then celebrate the people in your office. Say good job, right? It's okay to praise people. You end up keeping people longer by acknowledging their contributions to the organization. So what kind of leader are you? Because if you're going to talk about race and change the way you practice, change the way you work, change the culture in your office, you have to determine, are you one of these, or do you have all of these? And if you do not possess these qualities, is there someone on your team, on your executive team or management team that does? I had a former principal that told me one time, if you don't know, hire the people that do. I'll go back to who are the leaders in your office, right? Looking at that. So another factor before you can even start talking about race, and don't worry, I'm going to get to race conscious leadership in a minute, the generations. Oh my goodness, I've done so much work and studying on the generations and what's in the workforce now. And I just want to kind of go over this quickly because these two things, the type of leader, the generation of the people who are representing leadership, all will help determine what is the best thing in terms of changing the culture of race in your office. So we have the baby boomers who are still working, who are working longer. They typically are the folks who are leading offices, right? They're people who've been in and can bring the historical context as to why we have operated and functioned this way. The Generation Xers, right? Those are the 40 to early 50-year-olds, right? Who are the smallest generation, working generation right now. But they were the generation, I call it, going from the old school way of doing work to the tech way of doing work, right? From the rotary phone to the iPhone, right? They're the generation I call the interpreters because they can work in multiple places. They also are the work hard, play hard generation that you hear about, the MTV generation. Then you have the millennials. And I need to remind everybody, because millennials get a bad rap, but they are actually the most liberal, the most tech savvy, creative, and confident generation, right? But sometimes they are the gold star group because we have praised them for the work consistently. But millennials have a whole lot to offer. And I want to express to people on this phone call who are in the age areas here is that our millennials are in their 30s and mid 30s. And so we keep addressing them as young people, which they still are. They're younger than we are, but they are the generation that we really need to go to when we talk about this race conscious conversations. That's the generation that we should definitely have the discussions on how to implement these things. And the last generation, and that's the generation my children are in, is Generation Z. They are the largest and the youngest living generation, and they are the most ethnically diverse. And so when we're talking about race, the decisions we make now in terms of representing the clients we represent and changing the culture in your office, this is the generation that's going to feel the impacts of our work. So let's dip into what do we need to do? Implicit bias, right? You have to first understand what these terms mean because they are used a lot. It refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. I don't think anyone on this call will come into a space and say, I want to be racist. Whether you are white or Black or Latina or any other nationality, right? But we all come with our own implicit bias, right? Whether it's work, right? I may hire the same type of people. I have implicit bias. When I look at the staff in my leadership team, they happen to be mostly African-American women. But I'm in Atlanta, and there are not a lot of women in powerful positions in executive leadership, especially in the nonprofit world. So yes, I have implicit bias, but I have to also acknowledge it and understand it and be able to answer why. Is the leadership team in your office all people, non-people of color or white people? I use these terms interchangeably. I do not mean to offend. And so if that is the case, the question is why? We typically hire the people that are like us. And it takes a leader to really identify where their shortfalls are to say, let me look at my leadership team. Let me look at, am I only bringing in on the administrative level, only people of color? And the question is, why? So systemic racism, also known as institutional racism or structural racism, is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. The criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, whether you disagree or agree with me, is racist. When you have a disproportionate number of Black and brown people locked in cages, that is a result, that is a reaction to institutional racism. We must identify it first and then figure out a way to fix it, right? So Is everything in your workspace racist? No. But how you work are symptoms of it. And you have to understand and analyze and be comfortable with being uncomfortable about asking the question. Are you paying attention in your hiring practices? Show me your team. So I cannot remember right when the racial justice movement was happening in May and June of 2020. There was a big corporation, and the name escapes me, I really can't remember, that asked, they were really interested in how diverse the leadership team was. And they started to ask companies and nonprofits, let me see what your team looks like. Because you claim to be inclusive. You claim to be about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are buzzwords you're going to hear a lot over the next few years. But show me your team. Show me your leadership team. Show me your board, right? So start to unpack those things, right? And please remember, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, today's subject is about race, but there are multiple ways that you can have diversity in your organization. And are you soliciting information from people who do not necessarily have leader titles? And I'm going to go back to this and go back to this throughout this presentation. Name your non-traditional leader. Sometimes the person that can lead you in these conversations, these crucial conversations we're going to talk about, are people who don't hold the title. So I always put my money where my mouth is, and I hope this came up big enough on your screen, is show me your team. So this was a meeting we had in Zoom space because of COVID in December. And this is a part of half of my board of directors and my leadership team attending an event. So not only are we diverse in race, we're diverse in age, we're diverse in gender, and you trickle down in region and sexual orientation and everything. So it is really critical that you start looking beyond who you are, right? And really asking the difficult question. It's okay, right? For now, it's okay if you look at your team and it's not as diverse, but as long as you can acknowledge your implicit bias and come up with strategies to repair that, then you're heading in the right direction. So let's talk about how do we have these difficult discussions? How do we talk about race in the law, right? I made a statement that the criminal legal system is racist. I truly believe that. Was I comfortable saying that years ago, even though my father was victim to the system? Absolutely not. Am I more comfortable now? Yes. Why? Because I've been able to have open conversations and real conversations with other people who think like me, but we're very afraid to say something. But you must also remember to think about what barriers contribute to non-inclusive environments. So when you assess your team, right, it's time to have a difficult discussion. You may have a lawyer that comes back into your office and says, a judge yelled at me, or a judge called my client a derogatory remark. Or someone on my support team, a client came in and it was a Black person and they made a statement like, well, you know, and I'm going to tell you this story. Well, you know, that happens to you all of the time, right? They have implicit bias or they make assumptions, right? So how do you first look at what barriers will keep me from having these conversations, okay? The first thing is sadness, right, of what's happening, what's going on. They just can't take that. They're just too emotional to have the conversation about race. I did not watch the George Floyd video. I heard about it, I saw a still shot, but I could not do it because I have a Black son. And I could not imagine what his mother felt like, right? So I understand that people were there. Fear, people don't want to be labeled racist, right? It's a word that it's a trigger word for many, many people, right? Guilt, you saw things happen, or you saw where you weren't followed in the store as a non-person, a white person, but your colleague is Black, was followed around Macy's, had on a suit, coming from court, same thing, right? And you feel guilty, but you just don't want to address it. Exposure. You contributed to the issue. And that may be a barrier that keeps you, once you've been told, keeps you and you become defensive. Exhaustion, you're tired of talking about it. I've heard people say that in trainings recently to me. I'm just tired of talking about this. Well, if we don't talk about it, it's not going to go away. It's not going away, and it has to be repaired. Ignorance, you just didn't know. I sat in a leadership group and they had no idea about the talk, right? And if though for those on the call, it's the talk that Black parents have to give their sons and daughters when they learn how to drive. If you get pulled over, make sure you have your hands on the steering wheel. Make sure you tell a police officer you're reaching for your license, right? Don't drive at a certain time at night. Only have one person in your car. And I'm saying all these things because I have a 16-year-old girl who is now driving. And then it's just uncomfortable. But we got to get uncomfortable if we want things to change. So look at the barriers that you have and ask people if you have to have one-on-one conversations to start with, to see where people are, gauge the temperature in your office. I had a leader went in, they got fired up after June when all the other protests were happening, and they came in and they just wanted to go head first into talking about race. And they got a lot of pushback, not just from the white lawyers in their office and their support team, but also the Black lawyers, because they were not ready. You have to kind of divide it and then bring them together. The other thing to think about before talking about race is, what are your core values? Every family that I know has a set of values. So in our house, to be kind to one another, to always give back, service is important. Whatever your values are in your office, these are some of the values that I've seen defender offices across the country have. Values of respecting for all, client-centered representation. And I promise you, I bet money, most of the folks on this call are big about clients. Your client comes first above all, right? Honesty, loyalty, open-mindedness, whatever your value, excellence, commitment. Who are you as an organization? Because if equity or equality might be a value, because you have to pull from these values and refer to these values before you even start talking about what race is and racism in your office. This is something I find that's so just important. You are a designee that people trust, must be an interpreter. You have to have someone, when you have a lawyer come into your office, and I'm going to show you a scenario in a little bit, where the lawyer or other staff person is upset. We had a lawyer that was very upset, a Black man who was upset because he was always asked to second chair a criminal case, but not given any big responsibilities, and felt that because he was Black, in the first chair lawyer was white, was why he was been asked to second chair. And of course, the client was Black. And so when that challenge is brought to you, right? The first reactive, because we're a reactive society, say, no, I'm sure that's not it. Before you do that, stop, listen, absorb what they're saying. If you don't have a direct response, you say, you know what, let me think about that. Why do you say that? What makes you think that, right? And so get that information. And then if you need to talk it through with someone you trust and say, hey, this is what this lawyer experienced. And for us, it's another African-American male lawyer may say, you know what, I felt the same thing when I came into this institution. And let me tell you what I did. Or let me talk to that person. But it's really important. An organization called Basic Diversity said, you got to have a cultural informant, right? There are some things that you think are okay to do and say because you're trying to prove that you are inclusive that could be offensive to other people, and you're not intentionally doing that. And that's why having those safe spaces to say, you know what, John was not trying to be offensive. He was trying to be inclusive. I know John, he's a good person. So that you can then, that interpreter can then talk to the person who may have felt offended by the statement and say, no, I know where his heart is. I know what he was trying to do. This is not the case. I trust them. And that person probably trusts that you are telling them the truth. You cannot work in silos in doing these conversations, right? It is really important. Oh, it doesn't fit my description. I'm the juvenile defender. I don't have to deal with adult cases. I don't have to deal with human resource HR issues, things that happen. It is going to be a collective community that has to agree based on the core set of values that you that I listed before, that we are going to have these uncomfortable conversations so that it can lead to progress and ultimately change. Basic diversity is in the corner. And when I talked about having a cultural informant, I got that term from them. It is Basic Diversity CEO is Al Vivian. He is the son of the former civil rights leader, C.T. Vivian, who passed away, I think it was last August. I think he and John Lewis passed away on the same day. And he said, you need to have a cultural informant, right? And that's what's bolded in this PowerPoint is it's important to understand it is okay to ask why. But that cultural informant has to be comfortable in answering the question. For example, we built a safe space in an organization, a leadership group I belong to. We had the difficult conversations. Now fast forward, the Black Lives Matter movement happens, the protests happen, and as a designated cultural informant myself, I had a woman who was a big CEO at a big company ask me a question here. I live in Atlanta, and said, Illy, I don't understand why everybody's so mad. Why now? Why are they all protesting in the street? She just couldn't get the connection, right? And I had to, but she felt comfortable enough to ask me that question. And I answered her and said, because these things have been happening for decades, for centuries. And now that people have a moment to stop and watch and nothing has changed, people are tired. And this is a response, right? This is a response to have people listen, because now you, as a white woman in a very privileged position, actually listened and came to me and asked a question. So it's always important to have someone in your team or in your circle. Clearly define expectations. Okay, so we're talking about race. What do you want to do? Is the goal to make your offices more inclusive? Is your goal to provide equity so that your leadership team is more diverse, so you have people of color? Is the goal that your staff, your team, treats the clients, the people that you serve, better? They don't make side comments. One time I was in my story, and I'm not sure how much Jonathan Rappin shared with you. So my father was incarcerated in Attica, and my brother wasn't even born when my dad was sentenced to Attica. And so we spent our entire childhood visiting him there. Unfortunately, when my brother became 20 years of age, he too ended up in the system. And one year, my daughter, who was probably about 9 or 10 at the time, and I went to visit the prison, visit my brother, my younger brother. And then we go into the prison. It was the first time. It was in New York State. I had never been, I hadn't been in New York State in a number of years. I live in Georgia. And I come in and I say, hey, this is my name. This is my child. What do I do? And he said, oh, it's the same routine. It's just like any other day. And I looked at him because he assumed that I knew this routine. He assumed because I was a Black woman. Yeah, it's just like any other prison. You do the routine. It's the same process. And that implicit bias, right, is what carried him through. That implicit bias led him to say that microaggression that you hear. That's what that was coming from. And so now let's translate it into your office, right? A client comes into your office. They have a charge. Their fear is, I may lose my children, or I have a situation if I can't spend a night in jail. And then you hear someone in your office says, oh, they just don't want to lose their food stamps or social services. You automatically assume that because that person is there. And typically people assume because it's a Black person who falls below the poverty line that they're on welfare. We don't know that. We know there are people who work as cashiers at Target and Starbucks are people that public defenders and some of you represent. So it's very important that you figure out in your offices, what is the challenge that you're trying to address? What is the racial challenge that you are trying to address? What have you heard at the water cooler, if you will? And for in this virtual space, what is the reigning thing that keeps coming back to you as a leader? Meet people where they are. Everybody is not in the same space. Some people have gotten shocked to what has happened because they would never experience it, right? Some people never know what it was like to be followed in a store. Some people never know how heart-wrenching it is to have the talk with your child because you don't want them to have a hoodie on walking in the park next door, right? And so some people this is new to them, right? While others have been experiencing this their whole lives. And so you have to give a little grace. I'm a firm believer, there's a thing my daughter taught me, cancel culture. Someone does something that is racist or people interpret as racist and they or say something and others want to automatically cancel that person out. Sometimes I call it, some of you may have heard the term overly woke or you're woke. Oh, he's woke. He's a white person that gets it. He gets it. That's great. But sometimes you can be overly woke. You can be too aggressive in canceling another white person out because they simply didn't know or they didn't get it. So we have to be very careful to meet people where they are. And the only way you do that is to analyze it, okay? Transparency, please, please, please. I cannot begin to stress. You have to explain to your folks what you are trying to do. Find people in your leadership team, right? And remember, leaders are not necessarily the traditional definition, who can help explain what is going on. Because sometimes the way I explain it and the way maybe my marketing director explain it or my administrative assistant explain it may be very different. But you have to tell people why this is important to our organization, why it's important to the individual people that work with you and what you're trying to do. And sometimes as leaders, we tend to not give all the information, right? And I get that because we're so used to working in a traditional organizational structure, if you will. Safe environments to have dialogue. If you can do it, it is better to have these difficult conversations in a retreat style. Do not drop a bomb about race for a 1 hour conversation and then walk away without a follow-up. It is really, you give some days and some dialogue, right? Oftentimes when Gideon's promised this training, we try to do it in a place where we're all together, a little bit remote, to have these conversations. Whenever I talk to our team about race and culture change, we don't do it in the office. We go off-site, right? Because sometimes people will let their guard down a little bit. They'll let it down a little bit if they're not in their work environment. And also, being in your office is distracting. Nothing beats having a solid team of people. I said this before. If you do not know how to do this, if you do not know how to facilitate conversations about race and values and culture change, hire the people that do. Find the people that do. Now, I'm not offering myself any jobs right now on this call because I'll get in trouble. But for example, I just did during the protest in June, a number of collegiate coaches called me and asked for me in this one particular sport to do a session on race and do a session on implicit bias and how can they have these crucial conversations with their teams. It's a sport that's predominantly white, but they were facing some challenges. They're athletes of color, they're Black athletes, were feeling alone and isolated, right? So they brought me in to help facilitate some of those very difficult conversations with the coaches first. And then now we're going to move into the player level. And so hire the people that do. Find the people who've been doing this work. And I want to make this caveat. Not every single person that is Black is an expert on race in America, okay? I'm not an expert. There are people who've written books before, but I have been able to implement and learn and basically take what I've learned and implement it in public defender organizations. This is like the best way to start having real conversations. So I'm going to send this to Lydia and the team, but we give scenarios. At Gideon's Promise, and I'm sure you guys have done this, if you did law school, mock trial, moot court, things like that. But we're talking about specifically to building an office culture that is comfortable. We have scenarios that we give our lawyers, and we take these scenarios from actual offices. We do an anonymous request, and we have someone gather this information. You might change some of the names, you might change like the where, but what has really happened, and I talked about the case about the gentleman who gets promoted. So several of our lawyers have shared that there's a perception in their offices that decisions about who gets promoted or how co-counsel cases are assigned is a function of race. One Black male lawyer expressed that he is routinely assigned to second chair cases when the defense team needs a Black lawyer at counsel table, but is not given a fair share of responsibility. That is how he was feeling, that Black lawyer. And so what we do with this scenario, and this is one of the more extreme scenarios, is we unpack that. Okay, small group. It could be a small group of newer lawyers. It can be a small group of supervisors. How do we address this? And we have a conversation, right, about how can we address this? What things can we do to fix this situation or to prevent this from happening to anyone else? And so I truly believe real life scenarios that come from within your office in a way that it protects the people who gave that scenario. You can change it. You can make it about another office. You can make it about a law firm. You can make it about a school system. But to be able to talk through these scenarios, to give recommendations and hear every other's points of view is very helpful. And the second one was about race impact. Oh, race doesn't impact anything. We're public interest lawyers. We're inclusive to everybody. That is just not the best way to go, right? All of us have implicit bias, and you have to be comfortable addressing. Now, John, you may want to think about that, right? Let's unpack that. Why do you believe that? What would make you say that? What would make you react that way? Why, and have an open dialogue about that. So I have a ton of scenarios that we've used, that we've gathered. So let's say your administrative support people are having a challenge and they brought it up. I would ask them, can you give me some specific examples? And then I would take those examples and create a scenario and give it to my managers and say, listen, how do we address this challenge? How do we bring these teams together? Woo, this term, anti-racist, becoming anti-racist, it's difficult. Not everybody likes this term. I believe in how do we have difficult conversations and how do we make change? And I go back to where you have to meet people where they are. Some people are in the fear zone. Some of you may be in the fear zone. You don't want to talk about this right now. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but you're going to strive to be comfortable talking about it. Then people are in the learning zone. What I found out during 2020, a lot of people simply did not know and were too afraid to ask the question, prime question. And I'm sure this is happening in your offices. Why would we all have group functionings? All the Black people are sitting together. Why do when I attend leadership conferences or defender conferences, there's a point in time during the weekend where all the Black lawyers all go off to dinner or all go off in a corner or automatically navigate to one another. There's the former president of Spelman College, which is a historically Black college and university here in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a women's school. She wrote a book about why are all the Black kids sitting in the cafeteria, right? And it's such a great book because it really talks about trying to find people that are like you. And finally, someone I knew, because don't forget, I'm the cultural informant, asked me that question. You're in this leadership group, but the 5 of you go off at the end of sessions. I said, because we've been raisins in a bowl of milk. We've been, we kind of identified, just like maybe a bunch of women will go off, right? Sometimes you don't even recognize how it feels to be the only one or the small group in a big group. And so the question is learning this. She had no idea. It wasn't about, I didn't want to mix and mingle with the other people in our group. It's just you want to be sometimes around people that look like you, that understand you, have had the same experience as you. And then the growth zone. I'm going to sit with my discomfort, right? I'm going to speak out when I see something. Now, I'm quite aware some of you may present in front of judges, or you may have leaders in your office, for those of you who are not in titled leadership positions, that you may not be able to have a conversation. But if you see something and you see someone is being mistreated, the first step into being anti-racist or talking about racist or being inclusive and talking about equity is to address it. I think a lot of reasons people have that guilt is because they witnessed things that they knew somehow in their gut was wrong, but they never spoke out. They never said something. And if we are going to change this system, it has got to be a collection of people. We know that white people in this country did not build the racist structure. Y'all weren't here 200 years ago, but we're here now. And I always say, now that you know, you can't unknow. So how can we collectively work together to make these changes? And so I pulled this from it was a website for surgeons when they were talking about implicit bias in the medical profession, how the way Black patients were treated versus white patients. And I really did a lot of research on Black women and why Black women were dying women who were giving birth and they were dying disproportionately. More Black women were dying after having children or during the childbirth process than their white counterparts. And so, this area here, I think this is a very good chart to help gauge the temperature about where your team is and where you are. Listen, listen, listen. People are not coming to you. Now, you do have some people who complain, but for the most part, if people have the courage, especially people of color, to come to you and say, this is something that offended me, or this is a thing that I see. Patrice Fulcher, who is the training director for the Maryland Public Defender, she said, she was on a call with me or a conference the other day, and someone said, call a thing, right? If it's a thing, it's a thing. Because if you don't address it now, it will start to fester and you will lose really good, talented people. You will really lose them. Sometimes we forget as lawyers, and I don't mean any disrespect, I'm married to a lawyer. Sometimes you all are so quick for the rebuttal, so quick for the response because you're trained litigators. You're probably the best litigators out there. But sometimes you have to take a moment, listen, absorb it, right? And as you absorb this information, it is going to be exhausting. It's a lot to take in when you are learning these things that you probably may never even see. And so it's really important. It's exhausting. So make sure you have someone else who's going through this work. How can we do things differently? Changing the narrative about the people you serve, people of color, changing the narrative, changing the culture is challenging. We've always done, why do you do that? We've always done it this way. Have you ever asked why? Have you ever asked, and I know John Rapping touched this, have you ever asked why your clients sit in one certain part of your office and everybody else? Have you ever asked why your administrative professionals sit in the corner and this group doesn't? Have you ever asked why all of the social workers are Black? Right? And so it's really important. And it's not that it's a bad thing, but you have to address the concerns. There may be a strategic piece of it. But if we are really talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and being really racial justice and equity, we have to look at our teams and the diversity in our team. I got to plug this because I wouldn't be a good person or a good wife if I didn't do this. Culture change, right? It is really, really important that you read this book, because it doesn't just pertain to public defense and changing culture and dealing with race. It is something that is applicable across professions. You want to be careful not to become indifferent. And what could happen, we've all been up in arms about what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what happened years ago to Tamir Rice. And as Mr. Rapping probably said to you all before, for every person killed by a police officer, there are tens of thousands that are thrown into cages, disproportionately people that are Black and brown. We know this is going on. We cannot leave it up to other people to make it change. Now that you know, you can't unknow, but you have to be careful not to get wiped out talking about race. You don't have to talk about it every day. You just have to be aware of it. You do not want to become indifferent. And this is a painting by Frank Wu. It is a painting that sits in our home about indifference. And it's a set of robotic legs walking past a homeless veteran. We have to be careful that we don't get so worn out that we say, oh, it's just the way it is. We have seen young people, those millennials, the Generation Ys, and some of the Zs out in full arms. They want to talk about these things. They want to help be more equitable. Remember, they're the most diverse group in this country right now, right? They are the next set of leaders. And so for us, it is our responsibility to have those scenario conversations, those crucial conversations, to look inward to see, are we doing everything we can to be equitable, to be race conscious in our workplace? It is extremely important we do that. And so the other thing I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to open it up to questions for a few minutes, is, but what does our society look like? And I mentioned this before. I know things are changing when I see, even in the last 11 months of this pandemic, when I see more movies and television and Black actors, when I see leadership of Black women in CEO positions, when I see nonprofit leaders excelling that are people of colors, when I see diversity in teams like my very own team, executive leadership. And so what does the world look like in the defense community, right? In the legal community? So it is going to be a windy road. It takes time. There's a term that I think you may be interested in. I learned this from Nicole Ash. She is the Chief Human Resource Officer at a company called Iconics. And she mentioned performative activism. Performative activism. Yes, it's great that you are up in arms. Yes, it is great that you want to make change. But what are you going to do? Are you performing, right? What is the result? What is the return in your hour investment of sitting and listening to me talk, right? What are you going to actually do? Are you going to take these tools? So that was one thing. And then I'm going to leave you with this. And I heard this, as you all know, and this, no matter what your political beliefs are, there was a young poet laureate, and she's getting a lot of publicity right now, Amanda Gorman, who was the Youth Poet Laureate at the inauguration on the 20th. And one of the things she said was, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. Now that we know, what are we going to do? And so I thank you for having me. I know I ran a little bit over. I don't know if we have any time for questions. I'm gonna leave it up to Lydia, but I thank you for listening to me. And if you need to reach me, I'm at Gideon's Promise.
Thanks, Illy. That was tremendous. A lot of tangible, actionable advice. There was just one hand that went up that I'm not sure if L. Alexander still had that question. It went up near the beginning, so it may have been something that was addressed during the course of the presentation. Oh, I see the hand has gone away. All right. So I think
it was materials. I will send it to the Bar Association, some of the materials. We can send them the slide, but also the actual materials, the anti-racism, the different materials that I have that I put embedded in the PowerPoint to help you. And also, I would love to share with you some of the scenarios we used when we did trainings on race for our leaders. So I will definitely send those to you as a guide.
I loved the content and the fact that the Viola Davis clip included Cicely Tyson, at this moment of her passing. So that was extra moving. But I was also thinking that The Good Fight is kind of an interesting portrayal of a very diverse law firm with Delroy Lindo and Cush Jumbo as well. So thanks everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. I know the BHBA tends to send out surveys afterwards, so we look forward to your feedback. And thank you so much, Illy, for taking the time to present with us on this important topic. We really appreciate it.